There are a few sermons, I think, that have ever changed the landscape of a nation. There are a few that I remember in my life that I've heard or that I've even preached. Some of those sermons that I've heard have been one by the name of Shane Claiborne. Some of you might know that name. He's written Irresistible Revolution, one of my top 5 reads in my life. He is actually a Methodist minister. Shane was discontented with American church. So he called up Mother Teresa in Calcutta and said, I want to come serve with you. And she said, come. Well, what do I need? Come. That's all she would say. So he writes about that experience and how that transformed his world. And he started to live a little simpler. He started to let go of the things of this world that he had chased and started to chase Jesus with all of his heart. And he had been invited to different conferences throughout the nation by church leaders and gurus to come in and share his experience and to tell and encourage the church, here's how to live a simpler life. And one time he got up on the stage, and this is literally how he began his sermon. He said, I'm going to preach to you the greatest sermon you will ever hear. That's going to get anyone's attention. And all he did was quote Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Sermon on the Mount. That's all he did. He just quoted Jesus' words, and he sat right down. And I was just thinking, the moxie on that guy. But he's right. He's right. The greatest sermon ever preached is Jesus' own words. Why do we need to add to them? Why do we need to have commentary for them? Why do we need to interpret them? Just do them, and life would be so much simpler. There's another sermon that I remember, and I actually never heard it because the guy preached it a lot longer before history than I was ever born. Some of you might know this sermon title, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Anyone know who preached that sermon? Jonathan Edwards. He was a man who was around during the 1700s in America and New England, and he preached that sermon multiple times, and it became almost an iconic sermon for Americans. You see, the style of sermons and preaching is very different in the last 250 years, right? Some of you grew up in the old hellfire and brimstone era, where every Sunday the preacher would scare us about the punishment of sin. Quite frankly, some of us want that type of sermon again. I've been asked and encouraged even, hey, why don't you bring some of that hell and fire and brimstone out? Yeah, when it's appropriate, some days I might, and some days I will. And maybe today we'll talk about it a little bit, because sin does lead to damnation. We are all dangling from the web. We are all at the point of not really being able to escape the wrath of God. And the faster we learn that truth, the more we'll really appreciate grace. Because you can't fully appreciate grace until you've understood what you're given grace from. We have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Every one of us stand guilty before the judge. And the gavel will swing. And the only way to ever be recognized and remembered by God is when our sins are completely covered by the blood of Christ. That's called atonement. He no longer can see our wickedness. He can no longer see our sin if we've been bathed in the blood of Christ. And we all have to respond to that truth and that gospel. And Jonathan Edwards poetically and even emphatically articulated the truth of that message in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I would invite all of you, I would encourage all of you, I would persuade you with every word I have in my English language and even some other language that I don't even know to read that sermon. It will change your life. But there's one sermon that really kind of stands alone above all other sermons that I've really ever seen or witnessed. There are a couple of sermons that I remember in my life that they kind of stand elite, they stand alone. The one sermon that I think of when I hear a question like, what's the greatest, or what's the one sermon that you remember in your whole life above any other? It's the one where it prompted me to walk down it would be on the east side of our old church that I grew up with. I remember the revival night clear as day. I remember the preacher started to share things about Jesus' love for me and how he went to the cross on my behalf, and the torture that the Son of God went through, the brutal beatings, the betrayals of Judas, the denials of Peter, the loneliness of the wrath. The crucifixion itself, the screaming that Christ would have done as they pierced his hands, and even the statement to Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? The first time Jesus ever felt alone was when he took on our sin. That moment for me was one that I'll never forget. I'll never forget that sermon. And when he cast the invitation to come forward and to say, you have an opportunity to respond to something that's given to you free, regardless of what you've done, regardless of anything that you can do, all you have to do is accept. That sermon I remember. What are some sermons that you'll remember? I am not so arrogant to believe that this sermon will change the landscape of the nation, the one that I'm about to preach. I am not so arrogant to believe that the words that I ever would say, in even all of my lifetime, would affect a nation like the one that I'm about to share with you, that someone else did. But there was a man who changed the landscape of a nation in a very dramatic form that we don't know very much about. We know some things about him. We know that he was born in Scotland. We know that his name is John Witherspoon. We know that he was imprisoned during the Highland Rebellion because about 40 years before America rebelled against Great Britain, so did the nation of Scotland. And they were ready to throw the yoke of tyranny off of themselves, and they rebelled. And during the Highland Rebellion, it was a very politically divided country by the country of Scotland. There were people in the Highlands, people in the Lowlands. Most of Scotland were Presbyterian, as some of you might know that. And they were very divided in their Presbyterian faith. Some were called Seceder, some were called Anti-Burger, some were called Old Light, some were called New Light. And it was all about the political alliances that the church had started to establish with the country of Scotland and with the country of England. And during the 1740s, John Witherspoon gets caught right in the middle, right in the crosshairs of this big political divide and even cultural and country divide. After 2 years of imprisonment, he was invited to come to a little college in New Jersey, the University of New Jersey. They asked him to be the president of this Presbyterian school that would later be known as Princeton University. And while he was there in his leadership, Princeton thrived. They started to make some strides. And one of the things that I think is the most fascinating about this guy by the name of John Witherspoon is he was a forerunner to a couple of guys that are significant for this church. Thomas and Alexander Campbell. Does that name ring a bell for anyone here? See, you might not know this, but we are called Rising Sun Church of Christ. And the reason we're called Church of Christ is because we stem from a movement that was established early in this country called the Restoration Movement. And the fathers of the Restoration Movement are Alexander and Thomas Campbell, along with others like Barton Stone and Raccoon John Smith, who really were tired of the divided names. They were the ones that said to us and to the future generations and to posterity, hey, how about we shed the old names? How about we let go of those political alliances that we've had? In Scotland and even in early America, Presbyterians were called Seceder or Anti-Seceder, Old Light or New Light, Burger or Anti-Burger. All terms that we don't even have to really dive into, but it was basically political alliance. When you would walk up to another Presbyterian, you would say, so are you a Seceder Presbyterian or non-Seceder? Are you an Old Light Presbyterian or a New Light Presbyterian? Sometimes they even had more complicated names than that. Some people would be called Seceder Burger Presbyterians. Some people were called New Light Seceder Burger Presbyterian. And Thomas and Alexander Campbell, they went, this is ridiculous. Why do we care which political alliances? That's like saying, are you a Republican Church of Christ or a Democratic Church of Christ? Are you a liberal? Are you an independent? Are you a libertarian? It didn't make any sense for them. And Thomas and Alexander Campbell, about 20, 30 years after John Witherspoon came, they started to knock down those old dividing walls. So this John Witherspoon is really kind of a forerunner in some ways to our heritage, which is kind of neat. And he encouraged unity to the Presbyterians before unity was even a thing. He personally discipled James Madison after he graduated from Princeton. After Madison graduates, he taught him Hebrew, he taught him philosophy, and he had other pupils too that are just remarkable. I've written down some statistics about John Witherspoon. He had personally counseled 21 senators, 29 representatives, 56 legislators, 33 judges, and 3 of those sat on the Supreme Court. He personally mentored a vice president and a president. And while he was president of Princeton, early in the year of 1776, he was asked to sit on the Continental Congress. So there was a gathering of people, and he started to preach a sermon called The Dominion of Providence over the Passions of Men. And he grabbed a passage in the echoes of Psalms. It's Psalm 76:10. And the whole message was around one verse. And this one verse was, surely your wrath, God, surely your wrath against mankind brings you praise. And the survivors of your wrath are restrained. Now for us, that doesn't really register. We don't understand what's going on. So Psalm 76, the context of Psalm 76, some people believe that Apphek actually wrote that psalm. The reason he wrote that psalm is because in one of the histories, or one of the time of histories in Judah's time, about 700 BC, there was a king of Assyria who was coming against the king of Hezekiah in Judah. The northern kingdom had already fallen, and so now the only remaining kingdom of God's people to really destroy was Jerusalem. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, comes down from the northeast and starts to rout and then lay siege against Jerusalem. And the king of Judah, his name is Hezekiah, fell before the Lord. In fact, he was one of the most righteous kings Judah had ever known. His dad, Ahaz, actually sacrificed some of his brothers and sisters in the fire to Baal. So Hezekiah, being raised with that example as a dad, turned back to God and said, not me and not us. So he turned his entire nation back to God himself. And as Sennacherib laid siege to Judah, God showed favor on Hezekiah's faithfulness. And the result of his faithfulness, there were about 185 soldiers in Sennacherib's army that died overnight. The people of Israel witnessed this, they saw this, they went, whoa! Man, even man's most defiant response to you, God, you bring glory to yourself. I mean, the most depraved man in all of creation, it brings you glory, and you even reserve a little bit of that as a sword on your shield. The NLT translates Psalm 76:10, human defiance only enhances your glory. You use it as a weapon. And so this guy by the name of Jonathan Witherspoon actually preaches this sermon, and it changes the landscape of America? What? It would actually become one of the most catalytic inspirations of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams would get together after hearing this sermon, and they would say, we need to do something. Did you hear John's words? These are some of the excerpts from his sermon, and just so you know, I've read this sermon about 4 or 5 times, and I'm just so blown away at the depth and magnitude and gold in this sermon. We've given you copies on the back table there. There's about 10 hard copies for those of you who are digital. If you want to download it, go to our app, and you can find it, and it's downloadable there. Take time this week and read through this 20-page sermon, and you think my sermons are long, okay? 20-page sermon, this guy just unloads on America, and it changes the entire landscape. It's fantastic. But here are some excerpts from it. This is how he starts his sermon. This is his opening words. There is not a greater evidence either in the reality or the power of religion than a firm belief of God's universal presence and a constant attention to the influence and operations of his providence. He also goes on to quote this new pamphlet that had just been published in the year 1776. Some of you might know about it. It's called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. It's a great pamphlet. You should read that. Get to know the history that we come from, because it's only in the history that we'll ever really know our projections on where we're going. He goes on to say in this sermon, a good form of government may hold the rotten materials together for some time. Did you hear that? A good form of government may hold the rotten materials together for some time. When the manners of a nation are pure, and when true religion and internal principles maintain their vigor, the attempts of the most powerful enemies to oppress them are commonly baffled and disappointed. He also says in this sermon, if your cause is just, you may look with confidence to the Lord and entreat him to plead it as his own. You are my witnesses. This is the very first time of my introducing any political subject to the pulpit. And at this point, however, it is not only lawful, but it is also necessary. And I will willingly embrace the opportunity of declaring my opinion without hesitation that the cause in which America is now at arms is the cause of justice, liberty, and human nature. Imagine what they're facing. They're facing a tyrant across the seas, and they're wondering, what do we do about this? We are also facing the same sort of tyrant today. We have a tyrant that some of us think are distant, that's kind of out there. We don't have to worry about our enemy. And I'm not talking about a physical enemy. I'm talking about somebody who prowls the earth looking for who he might devour. We succumb to this warfare every day. Every one of us do. John would be the only clergy member that would sign the document that's in my hands. Everyone else, they weren't preachers, they were politicians. And here's what it says. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And you guys know the rest of this. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and should declare the cause which impels them to a separation, we hold that these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal. They were endowed by their Creator. What kind of sermon would inspire that type of attitude today? One time, John Witherspoon was being interviewed by a newspaper writer, and he said, "Are you sure that we're ready for independence?" And John's response was, "We are not only ripe for independence, but we are rotten for it." And I believe some of you sitting in this room today, some of you watching online today, you have been so inundated with sin, it's time for you to shed the shackles. You are not only ripe, you are rotten with it. Some of you might recognize the name Witherspoon. This is Reese's ancestor, the actor today. James Madison, the guy that he influenced, would go on to secure the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights actually was spawned out of the Declaration of Independence, which 12 years later would also be spawned out of the Constitution would come out of the Declaration, and then the Bill of Rights would come later. And the reason the Bill of Rights would come later is because there were enough people that were concerned that all of this Constitution and this new government that we were setting up actually would potentially infringe on our individual liberties. They would infringe on our individual rights. So people like James Madison and Adams and Jefferson, they would secure individual rights. And some of these we don't even consider anymore. We would just kind of take for granted, right? We just think, oh yeah, I know that I have rights as an individual, but we don't take time to know these rights. So just by way of review, you have the right to free speech, you have the right to free press, which means that you guys, I can get up here and I can say anything I want today, And you guys can say anything back. You can even put something on my Facebook, and you can block me, and I can block you, and then we can talk about each other's mamas. Isn't it great to be an American? I could say whatever I want. I do what I want. Then we have people that can record anything that we do. We even have the right to religion. We have the right to assembly, which I think is just fascinating. Do you realize that you don't have to ask permission from the state governments or from the federal governments to get together with people that you like? We are the only nation in the world, and we are the only nation that has ever been in the world that has been given these liberties and given these rights, and we just kind of take them for granted. In fact, we just assume that we're given rights. Of course I'm going to have the right to free speech and free assembly, the right to bear arms. My favorite one is, I have the right to not quarter any soldiers. Isn't that fun? And you're kind of like, well, I'm glad you put that in there. Which is actually evidence of the Ninth Amendment, which I think is kind of fun because the people who wrote these 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, the first amendments to the Constitution, they had enough foresight to know that the future generations, posterity, they might look at these future bills of rights and say, oh, well, that's what's limited. I only have 10 bills of rights or 10 rights. And so the Ninth Amendment should really be our favorite amendment. And this is what it says. It says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, the ones that we just discussed, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others, meaning other future rights, retained by the people. In other words, it's your catch-all amendment. The authors of the Bill of Rights went, we know that in the future there's going to be a lot more that people are going to come up with. And you know why they knew that? Because the first drafted Bill of Rights, the first drafted amendments, there were over 210 bills of rights. That catches your attention. After the second revision, it went down to 17, and then it went down to 12, and it was finally approved by a joint committee in 1791 to give us our 10. One of those original 12 that was finally approved at the third approval process was just approved in the 1980s. It's just remarkable how long and how much history we have when it comes to our rights. But here's the problem with giving us a Bill of Rights. And every parent knows this. You get this. You can't give somebody a right without first giving them a responsibility, right? Because people that have rights with no responsibilities tend to abuse their rights. Every parent knows this, right? Let's just do a quick evaluation. How many of you have ever had the keys taken away from you? It's church. We can be honest, be transparent. How many of you ever had the keys taken away from you? All right? Why did you have the keys taken away from you? You had the right to drive. The government issued you a driver's license. Your mom and dad probably handed you the keys to the car, or you even bought the car yourself. But eventually, something happened where you weren't responsible. Maybe you brought the car back and the tire wasn't quite on right, or maybe it was bented, or it had some damage in it. Maybe you just abused or neglected your responsibility, and eventually mom and dad removed that right that you have because you weren't responsible with it. Here's the weird one. How many of you have ever had or seen a door taken off of a bedroom? What causes that? I mean, that's just weird, right? I get nailing the door shut. I understand that. But to remove the door, that doesn't make any sense. What would you have to do to remove your door or your child's door? Cell phones are the same sort of thing. Some of us have the right, you have the right to have a cell phone. But if you're not responsible with the right that you've been given, that right is removed. And what happened with these guys who authored the Bill of Rights, there was an assumed truth that was common through all of their letters that they interacted with one another with, that they wrote to each other in, letters that they would give to their wives. There was just some assumed truths with each one of these. You see, in a nation where there are rights without responsibilities, there's anarchy. And these forefathers, these government fathers, they understood that because individual rights have to be coupled with individual responsibilities. See, liberty without responsibility has a tendency to gobble up liberty. When my liberty collides with your liberty, somebody has to decide what the truth is. Everybody demands their own individual rights with no consideration of other people, without taking responsibility for their liberty. Eventually, everybody will lose their liberty. And some of you are already ahead of me, and you're wondering, okay, well, if they had written the Bill of Rights, why didn't they write the Bill of Responsibilities? It's because they knew. They just knew that we would automatically have these responsibilities. You see, these three assumptions they're just littered through all of the literature in early America. And here's what these three assumptions are. The first one is that people were governed by some moral standard. All people were. There was some ethic that drove people. George Washington had written this, and I love this. This is just a good reminder. He said, "Religion and morality are the essential pillars of a civil society." Religion and morality. Those are the two pillars by which everything will be built on. For us to have a successful liberty, for us to have this experiment in freedom be something that we all grab a hold of and seize correctly, religion and morality have to be the things that hold them up. They're the essential pillars for us. John Adams, who had become the second president and actually Washington's vice president, said this: "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." A second assumption that the Founding Fathers had was this: that there's a sense of accountability. That everyone understands that they are being held to a higher standard, and they will be held accountable for the things that they do, for the things that they say. They'll be held accountable by people in their family, by people in their church, by people in their community, by the law if we have to, by the government if necessary. But eventually, everyone assumes that you're going to be held accountable. And in today's world, how many people live their lives or speak their things without even thinking they're held accountable? Whew. Can you imagine if our world lived with the fact, just these two, that there's a moral standard that governs everybody? And then the second element would be that one day you're going to be held accountable for what you do? How different would our world be today? The preamble of the Constitution actually is an indication of this. If you go back and if you remember what it says, "We hold these things to be" what? Self-evident. This is the does statement of the preamble. These are the things that, as they're writing them down in the Constitution, they're going, is this even necessary to say? I mean, do we have to say these things? Yeah, they're probably not going to know that later. But these are the self-evident things, that they are endowed by what? Their Creator. Not every one of the Founding Fathers were Christians. I got to be very clear about this. Not every one of them had this deep devotion to Jesus, but they did have a deep devotion to morality. They did have a deep devotion to accountability. They did understand that we're created, and they said that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So if you were to ask them, well, where do your individual rights come from? Doesn't it come from the government? They would say, not a chance. Our individual rights come from our Creator, not some government. The government's there to preserve those rights. And then it goes on to say that among these three unalienable rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see, there was an automatic assumption between God and rights that God, not government, bestowed these United States citizens with their individual rights, which means that they were all individually accountable to God at some point. And that's why they were able to establish the Constitution, Declaration, even a Bill of Rights later. But there's a third one that I think is significant that we have to say. Here's the third assumption that they believed: that you've got each other's back. That you're here for and with each other. Ben Franklin is famous for saying, when they were deciding whether to declare a Declaration of Independence, he said, fellas, if we don't hang together in this, we will hang together. We're in this together. I don't know if you heard it or not, but when I read the Declaration of United States of America, do you remember what it said at the very beginning? The unanimous declaration. There was an idea of unity that we could not get away from. Jonathan Witherspoon says this: perhaps there are few surer marks of the reality of religion than when a man feels himself more joined in spirit to a true holy person other than their own denomination than to an irregular liver of his own. I love the way they spoke. I love the way they wrote. Basically, what he's saying is when you see somebody who ascribes themselves to faith, whether they're a Baptist, whether they're a Methodist, whether they're a Lutheran, and you see pure devotion, you see that they are holding Jesus' hand. You want to understand what faith looks like? It's when you're able to hold theirs. The Restoration Movement used to say, we don't claim to be the only Christians. We just claim to be Christians only. There was an idea that we could reach arms across the aisle and join our brothers who held truth up. There was an idea of unity. Perhaps there's no greater illustration of this than the relationship of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. If you don't know this, spend some time looking at this relationship. It's very interesting. They used to be very good friends, and in fact, they were co-signers of the Declaration. They helped write the Bill of Rights and the Constitution itself. They were very tight. Thomas Jefferson's wife died, and so John Adams and his wife invited Thomas into his home, and they started to have a relationship. They had, I can't remember how many letters they have written to each other in their lifetime, but it was well over the hundreds. I think it was over 700 letters they had written in correspondence to each other. But there was a point in their political careers that they started to divide, that they were actually the forerunners of each political movement. And they could not stand each other. They started to hate each other. There was a guy that loved them both and said, gentlemen, this can't be. You have to fix it. And so they started to bring back and reach out to each other. What's interesting is that Providence would mark the thumbprint of his hand on these two lives. John Adams would die in 1826, and so would Thomas Jefferson. They would die in the same year. They happened to also die in the same month. They also happened to die on the same day. And they would die July 4th, 50 years to the day from the time they had signed the Declaration of Independence. So you see, brothers, separated, reconciled. This is what John Adams writes to you and to me. Listen to these words. This is just goosebump stuff, right? John Adams says this, posterity. I've already mentioned this before, but posterity means you and I. It's the future. He says, posterity. You will never know how much it costs the present generation. Go ahead, Colin. You will never know, okay, what it costs, how much it costs the present generation to preserve your freedoms. And he said, sure, you'll read about it. Sure, you'll probably hear about it. You'll probably watch some plays. You'll probably watch it in your little magic box that you have in your living room one day. But you will never really experience the fear and the dread that we experience, the anxiety that we had. You'll never smell it. You'll never feel it. You'll never touch it. You'll never really know. You won't know the meetings that we sat through, what it cost us, what it cost our families, financially and relationally. You will never fully understand what it cost us to preserve for you a future freedom. And I hope you make good use of it. And then he goes on to say this. If you don't, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it for you. We all have been given a freedom that the world looks to and is envious of. And we squander it. We squander it. John Witherspoon went on to write, God grant, this is how he ends his sermon. He says this, and as peace with God and conformity to him adds to the sweetness of created comforts while we possess them. So in the times of difficulty and trial, it is the man of piety and inward principle that we expect to find the uncorrupted patriot, the useful citizen, the invincible soldier. God grant that in America true religion and civil liberty may be inseparable, and that the unjust attempts to destroy the one might actually issue support and establishment of them both. Then he reinforces that Psalm 76:10. Human defiance only enhances your glory. Some of you are really hit with life. You've been hit with broken relationships. You've been hit with maybe brokenness and sin, and you think there's no hope. And you're right. There is no hope. You are desperate for a Savior. You are desperate to be set free of your bondage. And it's only in that desperation that we really, in any form that's real, can reach out to our Creator and say, help me. And it doesn't matter if you do or not. His name will be glorified in all of the nations. One day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that He is Lord. And Paul wrote to the Galatian people, and this is what he says. He says in Galatians chapter 5, I think it's verse 18, he says, we are called to be free, but do not lose your freedom to indulge, lose your freedom to indulge in sin. Instead, serve one another in love. You want to know what the greatest sermon ever preached in America is? It's not some guy that talks. It's you. You're the greatest sermon. People are watching us every day. They will see you, how you interact, how you love, how you assume that you're going to be held accountable, how you govern your lives by this moral code, how you go through trial, how you go through broken relationships, and they'll wonder, is there Jesus? Is this Jesus thing real? You have more potential than any sermon ever preached. You are the sermon that will change America. That's the truth. You just have to preach it. Lord, I pray that right now you would share truth with us, that you would convict us, that you would just pour into us your Spirit, that we would be people who belong to you. Jesus, we're desperate for you. Heal us personally. Heal this land nationally. And bring glory to yourself in the whole process. In Christ's name, amen.